October 23rd, 2023. Before I tell you what happened, or rather what's happening, I need to give you some background information about me and my family. Schizophrenia runs in the family on my mother's side, both of her parents. Suicide, although not an inheritable condition, is also surprisingly high in the Nichols-Jones family. My mother always warned me against drugs because she said it could kickstart mental problems that could not be undone, so I was a teetotaler all my life. Even before I knew my family's history, I always felt unsafe when alone. When I was just a child, I always had the feeling that there was something standing right behind me. The skin on my back would vibrate, and I would become well aware of every sound around me. This feeling carried over from Duplo, then Lego, then video games, and finally, it dissolved away somewhere around the age of 14. I had matured out of it, I thought. Despite the overwhelming feeling of eyes on me, I always attributed my discomfort to an overactive imagination. My puberty was thereafter free from the paranormal paranoia that plagued my youth, and I could focus on my other woes, such as my undiagnosed dweeb syndrome, as a fellow student once pointed out. Joke's on him. I make more money in a month than he does in a year now. Not to brag. I spent a lot of time working on myself. While my roommates partied and smoked weed, I spent my time either in the gym or behind the computer. All those parties I skipped paid off, because I could afford to buy my home outright at the age of 25, much to the surprise of my ex-roommates. I did that a week ago. It's not a big place, nor is it modern, but it's in nature, and I prefer that to downtown. It's an old, white, two-story house in the outskirts of Phoenix, without another building in sight. Just rolling hills of low cacti and succulents, all under the dry desert heat and pink sunset skies. The house is unremarkable, other than the fact it's lonesome despite looking like a copy-paste suburban home. It even has a perfectly trimmed emerald green lawn that halts at a knee-high white fence on the edge of the property. The water bill was going to be high to keep all that grass healthy, but money isn't an issue. So anyway, the first thing I did when arriving was installing an internet antenna on the roof, which took all but an hour or so. Then I set up a home office in what appeared to be a kid's bedroom. The room was barren, like all the others, but this one had some of those glow-in-the-dark stars and adhesive stickers on the ceiling. Those could be scraped off later. Setting up my workstation was the most immediate task at hand. It never rained in Phoenix, so I just flung some CAT8 cables from the antenna over the outside wall and in through the window of the kid's bedroom. There were two more bedrooms, one of which I would turn into a home gym. The other would be my master bedroom. The gym equipment was scheduled to arrive in a week, and until then, I would happily go jogging. So, after booting up my PC, I laced up my shoelaces and began my jog over the asphalt road that connected my beautiful home to the rest of the world. By now, the sun hung low in the sky, and I ran towards the beautiful pink heavens while jamming to some tunes and singing the lyrics as loud as I wanted. At that moment, without another soul in sight, I felt truly free. It was dusk by the time I returned. The lights in my house were off, other than the alternating, colorful glow of my computer rig in the upper left window. After a quick shower, I wrapped a towel around my waist and jumped behind my PC. With the lights off, headphones on, and screens bright, I melted into work mode. I'm not going to tell you what I do exactly. All I can really tell you is that I'm a contractor who signed an NDA. It's a good gig if you can handle it. It does require expertise and the ability for deep concentration, but these are both things I had cultivated. I could probably write a thesis in the middle of a water balloon fight. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that you couldn't distract me if you tried. However, as I was working, I gradually became aware of an old feeling, one that I couldn't place at first. It felt as though, while I was working, a strange and ancient anxiety crept up from the floor, slowly from my legs to my neck. A vibration that hummed the entire part of the back of my body until I finally had to give it my attention. Shivering, I cast my eyes back into my barren room, seeing only those glowing stars on the ceiling. I assumed, since the window was open and the desert heat had turned, that I was simply cold. I decided to go downstairs and unpack a fresh set of clothes from one of the boxes, but as I turned away from the screens, I felt that old feeling grow. Usually, looking back over my shoulder gave me a momentary relief, a relief that lasted little more than a few seconds, but something that at least told my logical mind that there was nothing to worry about. This time, however, the feeling grew with each step towards the door. I was on noodle legs by the time the lights turned on. I thought I had gone hyperthermic or something, but no. That's impossible because I was sweating like a madman. Then I thought I might have rubbed against some kind of toxic plant while jogging. But I'm an avid hiker, and I had never heard of anything that could cause this kind of reaction. There was no escaping my reality. There was no running from myself. I was afraid. Not just afraid, I was absolutely terror-stricken. That old feeling I had forgotten, suddenly, like a raging current, came back into my world. I was unprepared. Telling myself that there was no such thing as ghosts did very little. I knew that my fear was irrational, yet that knowledge did little to alleviate this feeling. When I was a kid, I had protocols with myself to manage this. Protocols my parents helped me develop. What did I do? I forced myself to think of the worst possible monsters I could to override the fear of the unknown. I imagined myself as a confident, fierce, and unwavering warrior. You know, the kind of warrior who doesn't have to run up the stairs after turning the basement light off. So, I did what I did as an 8-year-old. Except now, I wasn't a nose-picking, helpless little brat. Now, I was the handsome, 200-pound lean sex machine. I was also wearing nothing but a towel and indoor slippers, but that wasn't going to stop me from sauntering through this house. My house. No matter what I felt. If my lizard brain wanted to feed my body adrenaline and activate its fight or flight response, then it was first going to have to deal with my monkey brain, which was arguably in charge, more or less. I grabbed the handle with shaking intensity and flung the door wide open, exposing my bare chest and hard nipples to the oppressive sheet of darkness that was an unlit, unfamiliar home. To my left, there were the other upstairs rooms. The railing to my right overlooked the bottom floor by the front of the door. On the far end of the hallway were the stairs, which was also where the light switch was located. Try as I might, I simply couldn't force myself to do a casual strut. Instead, I did a nervous, robotic march. Like a plastic soldier, I made my way for the light switch. With an exultant snap, the light sprang on, and a long-held breath escaped my chest. However, something strange happened. It all happened in a fraction of a second. The only way I can explain it was that the light replaced the darkness as though it were a liquid. As though the light pushed the darkness into the corners, where it drained into the plaster. And in that fraction of a second, I heard a stifled breath. I stood there, frozen, other than the sweep of my eyes. That old feeling left, and instead, I stood like a shaking shell of a man. It took me 20 minutes to finally move. The only motivation was running down to the fridge, which had nothing but a cold six-pack. Along the way, I turned on every light in the house. I then climbed to the roof with my bruise and sat there in contemplation. Only when twilight broke did I retreat to my bed, with the lights on. October 24th, 2023. I'm a night owl. I sleep usually from early mornings to afternoon, so this hadn't affected my rhythm, and in fact, the anxiety was almost forgotten by the time I awoke. Full of bursting excitement, I began unpacking my boxes and decorating my house. So far, most of the house was empty, but my office and bedroom were quickly covered in nerdy memorabilia. Since there were no neighbors, I put my speaker on the windowsill and turned them outward. My experiment was to see how far the sound would carry during my daily jog. I call it an experiment, but really I just wanted to feel like I owned the world. Around the same time as yesterday, I laced up my sneakers and exited my home. After a quick stretch, I used my phone to start the tunes. To hear my favorite beats travel over this desert was a treat, like there was a concert just for me. Hell yeah, I exclaimed while starting my jog. A genre called dark western was always my jam. otherwise affectionately named Emo Yeehaw by other fans. By the time I was on my way back, Heathens by the Valley of Wolves was playing, and I sung unapologetically while nearing my home under the dusk sky. This time, all the lights were on full blast. The inside of my house was bright as day, which was fine. The energy bill meant nothing to me. Much like last night, I jumped behind the computer wearing nothing but a towel as I air dried. After a few hours of deep work, I had completed all my tasks and ordered some food. Nearly every restaurant said my property was outside of their service area. Ultimately, I found an Indian restaurant that agreed to bring it with a $35 compensation for delivery fees. Even I thought that was expensive. So I did something ingenious. I ordered 20 meals, averaging the delivery cost down to $175. I put on some clothes and ran downstairs to turn on the rice cooker. While in the kitchen, that strange feeling crept on me again. Scanning my dining room, I noticed that the lights were turned off, despite the fact that I could clearly remember turning them on. I remember because it was the only room in the house with a dimmer switch, and I imagined romantic dinners with future partners there. The anxiety was less intense but more directed, if that makes sense. Whereas last night I felt general discomfort, now I felt my senses spike in the direction of the dark dining room. Wanting to avoid repeating the strange panic attack, I immediately marched towards the dark. I thought turning the lights on would alleviate my stress, but that was not true. From the corner of my eye, I saw something move behind the curtain. Although it was a mere glimpse, it was human in shape, like someone was trying to hide from me. "Hey!" I shouted as a reaction, trying to sound brave despite the fact it scared the shit out of me. "Who's there?" The IKEA table hadn't been assembled yet, but the parts lay organized on the floor. That was supposed to be this evening's project. One of the table legs became my blunt instrument of self-defense as I slowly approached the hanging curtains. I assumed that a meth head had broken in, and I wasn't going to risk anything. So, without warning, I swung the table leg with as much force as I could against the curtain. I was under the assumption that I could hear a meaty thud and cries for mercy, but no. Just the sound of wood versus soft cloth. Surprised, I held my weapon high and ripped the curtain to the side, only to find emptiness. "What the fuck?" I muttered under my breath. I knew for certain that something was there, or rather, I knew for certain that I had seen something. Immediately, I wondered if my family's schizophrenia had been passed down to me. Ghosts and monsters never scared me because I never believed in any of it. What scared me was my own mind. That horrified me as a child because I knew that was real. At any moment, my mind could betray me and start casting my worst fears into the world. I decided not to despair just yet. Instead, I resolved to ignoring my symptoms like a real man and began assembling my IKEA furniture. 3 chairs and 1 table later, a soft click sounded. Although it was barely on the fringes of audible, the sound was unmistakable. It was a light switch upstairs. This time, I grabbed the unfinished 4th chair as a weapon before peeking my head out of the dining room. The lights were on, much to my relief, but I still felt compelled to investigate. After a tactical sweep of the house, I concluded that it had been the bathroom light. As far as I was concerned, there were 3 possible situations at hand. 1. I'm losing my mind, which was possible. 2. The house is haunted, which is nonsense. 3. There's some fault with the electrical layout, which was the most likely. This time, I stood alert and ready as the light snapped on. But there was nothing out of the ordinary. Relieved by the lack of paranormal activity, I descended the stairs again when I heard a loud knock. I let out a yelp and jumped the last 10 steps, the unfinished chair clattering down behind me.
"Hello?"
I heard an Indian accent from the front door. I opened the door and found a delivery man from Tandoori Corner, holding up a cardboard box. "Did you order 20 butter chicken?" he asked. "Yes, and 1 garlic naan." That will be $455.37. Would you mind sticking around a little while? I asked him suddenly. Before he could respond, I continued. I have a new co-op game and no one to play with. I'll tip you an extra $50 for every level you complete with me. Are you serious? 100%. He stared at me for a moment, perhaps wondering if I was a serial killer. After a long silence, I said, I'll even give you some butter chicken. Deal. The only PC game I knew to have split screen was called Project Zomboid, and it was one of my all-time favorites. He definitely saw that my account was tallied at over 3,000 hours, indicating that I was anything but new. He quickly discovered it wasn't a game with levels, so we just decided on $100 an hour pay for him to play with me. I think he thought I was just lonely, living out in the outskirts at the end of an empty road. I wasn't, but some company was appreciated. Despite the fact that we had a boatload of fun, that wasn't my goal. If anything strange were to happen and we both saw it, I would know that I wasn't losing my mind. It took all but a half hour before that creeping anxiety began seeping in. I looked over to Rajesh to see if he was feeling uncomfortable, but no, he was deeply focused. My palms became clammy, and I could feel my heart pounding. Try as I might, I simply couldn't hide my discomfort. Are you okay? Rajesh asked. You're hyperventilating. I began to speak when suddenly all the lights in the house turned off. The screen went black and we were cast into an abyss. I heard a terrible, horrible shriek that split my eardrum. It was Rajesh. In turn, he startled me and I shrieked. I then heard the pitter-patter of his escape and followed close behind him, both still screaming. When the door opened and the moonlight flooded in, it seemed a heavenly glow of salvation. Rajesh bolted for his electric bike and started pedaling like an Olympian. Wait! I shouted. What about your tip? Keep it! Outside, my anxiety was tame, but my sense still burned in the direction of that gaping, open doorway. At the very least, I knew I wasn't hallucinating, which wasn't much of a relief. What the hell was going on in my house? Immediately, I started calling Ronnie Tallahasse, the guy I bought the house from. We had met in a bar down in Atlanta, where he was visiting his mom. Told me she was sick and he was planning to move. Said his house in Phoenix was already empty and about to go up for sale. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, I had bought the house from him. I was wondering why the house was so cheap after seeing its perfect condition. Ronnie just had a really good sob story, and I thought I could take advantage of this opportunity. He must have known this place was haunted or something of the like. Maybe there's a gas leak causing irrational thought, paired with faulty electrical infrastructure. Despite the fact that it was past midnight, I started calling him and leaving messages, demanding an answer. I stood there for hours until daylight illuminated my house. When that happened, I took a few careful steps inside and felt no anxiety. After a deep breath, I assembled my last dining chair and retreated to my mattress at 8 o'clock in the morning. October 25th, 2023. I awoke at 12:45, which was early, but my night had been plagued by restless dreams. I spent the next 20 minutes calling and texting Ronnie with no response. His profile picture had been removed, and the call would go straight to a generic voicemail. What the fuck? I shouted before jumping behind the computer. Ronnie Tallahasse, you asshole! You have no idea who you're messing with. Let's make something clear, I'm not your average guy. I have access to records and databases that would make marketing companies cream themselves. Every conversation and document ever exchanged between me and Ronnie was pulled up, and after installing my fourth monitor, I began my investigation. He had sold the house directly to me because he was a real estate agent and was licensed to do all the technical stuff. All the documents seemed legit, but I couldn't find a single mention of him. The account that I had forwarded the money to was linked to a US enclave for a Nigerian company. The Nigerian company filed for bankruptcy in 2013, yet, due to some bureaucratic oversight, the bank account was still in use. Obviously, this was all very strange, but I owned the deed to the house. I had all the official paperwork, Unless all of that was fake. Oh, shit. I muttered as I made way for the garage. I wasn't sure where I was going. City Hall, perhaps? But I knew I had to go and figure out what the hell was happening. I jumped into my Mustang and started her up. The garage door lifted and I pressed the pedal to the metal, expecting to hear my tires screech against the concrete, but no. There was only a pathetic flubber sound. A tire was flat. Are you kidding me? I slammed the door shut and grabbed my bike pump, grumbling at the fact it was going to take an hour. However, I stood baffled when I noticed that all the tires were flat. And upon closer inspection, it seemed that they had been slashed by some large, crude machete. How was that possible? I couldn't even be angry. I was too dumbfounded. Defeated, I slumped into my chair in my dining room. Something was amiss. Maybe I was doing this to myself and didn't even remember. But would that even cross my mind if I was schizophrenic? How self-aware are crazy people? Do they have bouts of sanity? If I were to call people, would they get worried and have me sent to an asylum? I'm obviously losing my mind. It was 19:30 at that point, lunchtime. So I grabbed some buttered chicken and went back to my computer. Try as I might, I simply couldn't make sense of it all. Maybe I should call a psychiatrist. Maybe I should get some meds and these strange occurrences would stop. Maybe my whole life was an illusion. The degree of self-awareness in psychosis is not binary. Rather, it falls on a spectrum. Some individuals may retain a significant level of awareness and acknowledge their condition. In contrast, others may have diminished self-awareness, experiencing difficulty in recognizing their symptoms as part of an illness, said an article. As I was researching, I felt the anxiety return. This time it was going to be different. I wasn't going to sit there no matter what. I'm a grown-ass man, goddammit. I'm not supposed to be afraid of the dark. With speakers turned all the way up, my brightness to the max, and a gas-powered pellet pistol on my desk, I felt ready for anything. If I could power through this darkness-induced panic attack, then I would conquer it. My illogical lizard brain might learn that there was nothing to fear. With gritting teeth and thumping temples, I continued my research. Even when hallway lights spontaneously flickered off, even when I felt a malevolent presence in a cold breeze, I maintained my concentration on my screen. I refused to give in to my childish fear of the dark. I refused to peek over my shoulder and into the corners of my room illuminated by my 4 monitors. I refused, but failed when something brushed up against my leg. Immediately, I let out a yelp and lunged across the room, but not before swiping the pellet gun. Like some kind of D-rated action movie star, I did a clumsy, slow shoulder roll and slammed with my back against the wall. The underside of my desk was hidden in shadow, other than the orange power switch. Something moved under my desk and eclipsed that orange glow before I heard a click, and then the halt of my computer fans. The monitors shut off, and I was plunged into a dark and silent abyss. I jumped to my feet and began blind firing towards the underside of my desk. Somewhere in my mind, I wondered how ridiculous I must have looked. Truly, my sanity was gone, and yet another part of me, a part that screamed louder and demanded my body's obedience, told me there was nothing silly about this. This was life or death, and without light, it would be death. A sudden pain erupted from my left shin, as though a dull replica sword had been thrust against it. With my good leg, I jumped across the room and threw myself against the light switch, then collapsed onto the floor. During that split second in the air, which felt like an eternity, I saw something human-like, hunched over on all fours, scurrying out of the room. I emptied my clip while collapsing, seeing the pellets only puncture the wall on the other end. My wound was somewhere between blunt trauma and a deep cut. You know when you bump your shin into something and it hurts like hell? It wasn't bleeding much, but I knew my bone had been damaged by the sheer depth of the wound. A thumping pain, worse than anything I had ever felt, enveloped my entire leg. I immediately dialed 911 while trying to steady my breath, but the call didn't go through. I tried again and again, and a 4th time before seeing that I had no service. Luckily, I wasn't bleeding profusely, and I could probably halt the leakage with a tight knot. While still on the ground, I fumbled in my closet for a spare shirt to wrap my leg in, then a belt to secure it. Moaning and groaning, I slowly climbed to my feet. Hallucination or not, I was badly injured and had to make my way for a hospital. The hallway was pitch black, and my senses went absolutely haywire while staring into it, so I shut the door and locked it, then limped over to the window. While peeking outside to check the distance to the ground, I noticed something strange. The Arizona landscape around my house has been replaced by a flat expanse of grass. In my delirium, I thought that perhaps closing and opening my window again would reset the scenery, but no. It seemed my entire house had teleported to some emerald green landscape. The moon had expanded, and to such a degree that a good chunk of the sky was consumed by its soft glow, and the craters were visible to the naked eye. Had the situation been different, perhaps I would have cried at the sheer beauty of it all, but a banging had started on the door. Splinters began spraying from the weak wood and littering the carpet. Adrenaline consumed me. I grabbed everything in my room that gave light. This included a big lighter and some scented candles. My phone was at 12%, yet I maxed out the flashlight function and secured it in my breast pocket. The door hinges then gave way, and a long, slender black arm reached in like a tentacle feeling for the light switch. For self-defense, I slung an airsoft assault rifle over my shoulder and pocketed an extra clip. But I knew that wouldn't do much, so I grabbed my replica of Vader's saber. The beast's claw dug into the wall and dragged the paint off before it located the switch. Just as the oppressive darkness fell upon me, the red glow and the whoosh of the saber's blade came into existence, illuminating me under the scarlet glimmer. The saber's glow paired with my flashlight gave me a radius of safety, but all beyond the peripheral meant the presence of a satanic menace. For the first time, I saw more than a glimpse of the demon. Although its face remained beyond the crimson incandescence, its body revealed itself. Whatever this demon was, its stature was no more than the average person. Its shape was oddly feminine. The only thing that alluded to an otherworldly nature were its decrepit arms that could reach the floor even while standing. Its petite hands looked harmless enough, but I had seen what they could do. The demon stood cautiously, half shrouded by the shadow. Her uncertainty in the light felt strangely human, as though it mirrored my fear of the dark and what it represented. It gave me some confidence, something desperately required since my heart rate must have been in the 200s. My arms and legs shook, as though I were a newborn calf in the dead of winter. But something told me that this wasn't as one-sided as it seemed. Through gritted teeth and flaying spit, I managed a threat. "I'll shove this up your ass, you bitch!" One of her arms bent backwards to cover her face, and with the other she reached for me. I battered her away with the saber, and upon contact, she let out a screech before retreating back into the hallway. Baffled, but wanting to press on my advantage, I charged after her. There was a waft of fabric dispersing into the dark, almost like the sails of a sinking ship as it slipped into the abyss. Never before had the shadows felt this liquid, this suffocating, but I had no choice. I may not get another chance to hunt that demon. She was too quick, and somehow slipped past me. By the time I stood in the middle of the hallway, the light in my office had turned off. I was left alone, an island of glowing red in a sea of obsidian. She was quiet, nearly inaudible, yet in this dimension without sound, her scurry was as loud as a cavalry charge. Knowing she would most likely aim for my legs again, I swiped my saber low, mimicking the movement of a golfer. We collided at her wrist, and I confirmed in that brief illumination that she indeed aimed for my good leg. Whatever this demon was, it was no mindless beast. She had a plan and intention. After colliding, she let out another shriek, and this time slipped through the railings of the stairs and landed on the floor below. Not even a baby could squeeze through those tiny gaps, yet this demon seemed more liquid than man. I slammed the light switch and lifted the curtains of darkness from my immediate vicinity. Then I slung my airsoft rifle from my shoulder and aimed to the first floor, where I sprayed the light switch with an entire clip. The lower level revealed itself, and so did the beast. She rolled into the dining room as weightless as a tumbleweed. She had been waiting for me at the bottom of the stairs. The light switch in there was not in my line of sight, yet I reloaded and prepared for my next encounter. This fight could still go in any direction, but right now, god damn it, I was winning! I re-equipped my saber and ran downstairs, not towards her, but rather towards the kitchen. When in the kitchen, I quickly took a random assortment of over-the-counter painkillers and washed them down with a gulp of whiskey. Don't judge me, my leg hurt like hell. I had prepared a hammer, glue, and nails for my IKEA furniture, not knowing that the crafty Swedes had blueprints not requiring outside tools. For good measure, I slipped the bottle of whiskey into my back pocket and ran up to the kitchen light switch. I nailed it in a permanent on position, right through plastic and all, and ignoring mental warning bells against electrocution. I then saw her silhouette in the arch to the dining room. Again, her demeanor was strangely human, as though she were shocked to see what I was doing, and uncertain of her next move. After securing the switch with a glob of glue, I ran towards her. She retreated back and dashed to the far exit of the dining room. Around the downstairs light switch, there were peppered indications of my BB gun. Internally, I let out a small laugh before repeating the process. 2 rooms on the bottom floor had been secured. There were now 3 left: dining room, garage, and living room. The dining room, unfortunately, only had a dimmer switch, but I had some experience in building, and even more experience in demolition, so I used the hammer's claw to rip the dimmer switch off. Sparks rained against me, and I constantly looked over my shoulder, searching the pitch black. Without safety gloves, I touched the 2 wires together, bringing a permanent light to my dining room. Then I used glue against the exposed metal. By now, my hands were covered in the sticky substance, and the bottle was a mess of its own. I had used up almost the entire tube for just 3 light switches, but I had a safe haven. My anxiety reduced, and a sense of victory overcame me. Flushed with a sense of achievement, I walked towards the main hall, where the front door and the staircase met. The light should have been able to reach the second-floor railing, but the liquid obsidian hung like a curtain. She had turned off the lights at the top of the staircase. I knew she was staring at me, somewhere from the second-floor railing. My senses screamed wildly as I peered into the void. Briefly, I felt as though we had reached an equilibrium, as though we could coexist with an understanding. But that feeling was preposterous. She would have no mercy for me, so I would have no mercy for her. I aimed my airsoft rifle at the light switch atop the stairs and fired until I turned it on. The liquid retreated slowly this time, like molasses. Some even seemed to drip down to the bottom floor, landing not far from my feet. The beast was nowhere to be seen, yet I felt another decrease in anxiety, indicating to me that she had retreated, perhaps even admitting a momentary defeat. I ascended the staircase slowly with a saber in one hand, a hammer in the other, and some nails hanging from my hip. I calmly secured the switch and slathered the last bit of glue over it. The dining room was where I saw her last, but I could sense her watching me from my office. I looked over my shoulder only once and saw nothing, but I knew she was there because something briefly eclipsed the glowing stars. I waited for a few minutes for the glue to harden, then made my way for the kitchen. My adrenaline had gone stale, and I was left a shaking husk of a man. Thank God I was a night owl, since this all happened during the equivalent of my afternoon. Arizona had not returned, and my house was still planted in some infinite flat field. That massive moon hung above like an imposing monument to my insanity. There was no movement outside, no sound, nothing at all. Not even wind to caress the grass. I heard in another part of the house that demon scurry. It sounded like rats in the walls, or like a cat's claws on the hardwood floor. She was doing something upstairs, and I stood petrified in anticipation. It was too quiet to locate the source, but slowly the volume grew, until it became loud enough to deduce that it was atop the staircase. I grabbed my lightsaber and limped across the kitchen, my leg now impossible to ignore. At the top of the staircase I saw her petite little fingers reaching from around the corner and fondling the light switch. "Don't do it!" I shouted. In response, she jerked her hand away in shock and scurried off. It seemed my fix was good enough that it would keep her at bay, and with that, I decided to prep for the unfortunate possibility that I would be stuck here for a while. If I were to die in this strange plane of existence, then let it be due to starvation. I began breaking apart my furniture in the dining room for firewood, amassing a large pile that I accumulated into various pots and pans. I then positioned these emergency bonfires in central areas. While working, the demon began weeping somewhere in my home. echoing the soft sobs of a scared little girl. This led me to wonder if she needed nutrients, water, and perhaps even sleep. After prepping my emergency bonfires, I forced down another small bowl of buttered chicken, despite the fact that I had a raging stomach cramp. It was literally the only food I had at the moment, and if I were to survive, I would need to remain well fed. I tried to sleep on the counter while using an unopened package of napkins as a pillow. I knew I probably wouldn't be able to sleep, but I had to rest a little. The fear and pulsating agony of my leg kept me conscious. It didn't help that a demon was weeping softly from some unknown location in the house. But there wasn't much I could do in that moment, and I found myself dizzy from exhaustion, so I allowed myself some rest. October 26, 2023. I must have passed out at some moment because the next thing I knew I was waking up in a horrible panic. Sweat coated me, and adrenaline coursed through me from the moment I opened my eyes. Had my leg not been injured, I would have been standing in less than a second. But instead, I found myself with my back against a kitchen cabinet, eyes darting wildly through the room. It could have been seconds or hours. There was no way of knowing since I hadn't put batteries in the clock yet. The only indication that time had passed was that the bitch had stopped crying and my phone was at 1%. My charger was by the computer. Somehow, the fact that I had a mission made me feel a little better. What was I to do otherwise? Sit and wait until my buttered chicken supply is depleted? Or until the power stops working? Where was the power even coming from? Somehow, in some strange way, my house was still connected to Arizona. The plumbing also seemed to work just fine, so this gave me 3 tasks for the day. 1. Get my charger. 2. Ensure light on the upper levels of my house. 3. Investigate outside. Sliding off the kitchen counter revealed an immense pain where the beast had bludgeoned me. I had no first aid knowledge, so I simply let my leg fester as it did. Whatever home remedies I could imagine would probably make the situation worse. First aid was not a strong suit of mine, but DIY tinkering was. I filled the bag with tools, flat pieces of wood, and some more nails. Using the saber as a walking stick, I limped and dragged my leg out of the kitchen. Immediately, when passing the bottom of the stairs, my senses spiked in the direction of the upstairs walkway. Although it was well lit, my instincts set off warning bells. My eyes swept slowly and examined every minute detail, where I noticed the bathroom door was slightly open. A shudder ran down my spine, and my heart began pumping as the door slowly creaked shut. That thing was watching me. Anxiety seemed to work as a sort of radar, and my fear could be directed at spots where the beast lay in waiting. Perhaps she was hiding from fear, or perhaps she lay in ambush. Slowly, I began ascending the steps, during which I called out, "I'm coming up! Don't do anything stupid!" as I whooshed my saber on. By the time I had reached the top, I was shaking like a shrub in a storm. I divided my attention between standing guard and inspecting the light switch I had secured the night prior. It seemed she had attempted to claw at it without proper understanding, like an animal that knew a container contained food but wasn't certain how to open it. I had a cat growing up, named Skipper, who would knock sacks of wet food on the ground and puncture them with his teeth, but never extracted more than juices. This scene reminded me of that. Like the shadow beast had all the strength to remove the nails and scratch off the glue, but instead resorted to frustrating slashes. 5 rooms on this floor. To my left was the future location of my home gym, then my bedroom, then the bathroom, then a closet, and finally on the far right, my office. Last I had seen the shadow beast, she had closed the bathroom door from within. I took a single, cautious step in the direction of my office. No reaction from the beast. I took another step, then 3, and so on, until I stood before my dark office with little glowing stars on the ceilings and walls. The door had been absolutely demolished, and only a fragment remained on the hinges. I could hardly believe that that slender figure had managed such devastating damage. Looking down at my leg, I suddenly realized how close I was to dying in that moment, and even now. The light switch was around a corner which would require 2 steps, and then a turn into the dark. I stood there, silently, ears burning with anticipation and eyes wider than the sky in a flat field. I heard nothing and saw nothing, but I felt a deep dread at the thought of entering even 2 steps into the unknown. Much like the first night of my arrival to this house, I stood petrified by my office. I would have loved to say that I was in contemplation of my next move, but that would be a lie. My mind was utterly empty other than the pressure of my racing heart. With my saber forward, casting a red glow into the abyss, I finally made my step. From what I had seen, the shadow was faster than human, and if I were to make a race for the light switch, she would beat me. So I would have to beat her with methodical and calculated choices. If I can't win at her game, I can force her to play mine. I tossed a hammer into the room, and immediately the shadow threw itself against the metal and crashed into the wall. In that brief moment, she was distracted. I jumped in and turned the lights on. She shrieked like a banshee and lashed out at me with one of her long arms. She missed, and instead knocked the plaster out of the wall. Dust and debris peppered me as I swung my saber against her, hitting the back of her head. This time, I heard a desperate cry for mercy from her. "No!" she pleaded while dashing off into the hallway and throwing herself into the closet. Then, I heard her wailing in sorrow. Not the weeping of yesterday. This was the wailing of a parent that had just lost her child, or of someone who was in agony. It echoed from all the corners of the house, anywhere where there was darkness. I heard her crying. She was in every room with a shadow. Fearful or not, I had a mission. My hands were shaking and dripping wet as I secured the office light switch. That was one more room I had conquered back from the devil. Since my water and electricity were still running smoothly, a thought popped into my head. I immediately limped over to my computer and started her up. My phone may not have had any data connection, but maybe my PC would. It ran on an Ethernet cable after all. However, my house was off the grid, and I had installed an antenna on the roof to get connection. Regardless, I had nothing to lose. After a quick boot up, I confirmed that I had no internet. I plopped down into my chair and waited as my phone began charging. At this point, my $600 Android was nothing more than a glorified flashlight, but it might save my life. That demon kept crying, wailing a haunted sorrow that emanated from all angles. It reminded me that she was more gas or liquid than solid matter, yet, somehow, she displayed behaviors I recognized as human. She was frightened of me for some reason and spoke English. Maybe she hadn't said no, and instead just let out a little yelp that my mind interpreted as a word. So far, she hadn't responded to anything I'd said, but I also hadn't asked a question yet. My stomach churned violently, and I heard the gases in me rumble as a stinging pain bubbled up. My gut told me not to converse with the beast, although I knew not why. So far, my instincts had kept me alive, so I pushed away any thought of communicating with the demon. Suddenly, I felt a small bout of relief as I solidified within myself that she was an enemy. I didn't know what she was or what she wanted. I didn't know if she was inherently evil, or more like an animal operating on script like a rabid dog. By the sound of her cries, a part of me wondered if she was worth a shred of mercy. If she was perhaps in pain and in need of a savior. That shred now died, and was replaced with my own merciless lust for survival. I cared not for any kind of coexistence. I cared not to see her as more than a beast. That is nature, is it not? Perhaps she was the exact opposite of a human, an unholy mirror of man. She feared light and slept in the day, a nocturnal predator in the crevices of man's lodging and safe haven, a parasite to humanity itself. But I don't tolerate parasites. Suddenly, the fear and anxiety in me, which plagued me the moment I set foot in this accursed house, turned to something different. No longer did I feel repelled by the beast. Like two magnets that were forced by nature to avoid one another, something in me flipped so violently that I now felt compelled to hunt her down. I didn't know what she was. I didn't need to know what she was. And I didn't care what she was. I would reduce her to dust, rip her to the very essence of her chemistry, My phone was 40% charged, so I pocketed the charger and installed a strobe light effect, then began my hunt. She was a nocturnal beast in this parallel universe with no sun, but she wasn't the apex predator, for I too was nocturnal. "Shut up, bitch!" I shouted while kicking the bathroom door open. It swung open, violently, slamming against the wall. Her crying stopped, and a gasp sounded through the entire house. I found an incarnation of her on the other end, covering her face and hiding in the bathtub. I didn't bother to turn the light on. I was too focused on beating her with my weapon. Under the strobe light, our altercation became jerky and claymation-esque. She seemed confused and frightened at the repeated assault on her cover of darkness. It was a barrage for her, similar to how we might experience a subtle electrical shock over and over and over again, discombobulating and preventing us from forming any meaningful response to the attack. Every strike I landed left her obsidian skin sizzling, like steak charred on the grill for hours too long. It smelled of burning fat and blubber. One of her long arms covered her face, while the other flayed wildly against me and soaked the bulk of my attacks. "No!" she shouted, before slapping me on the side of my head and sending me spinning out of the bathroom door. My face was fine, but I felt a pulpy warmth where my ear was, and profound ringing. Despite my daze, I managed to keep hold of my saber, as I considered it my lifeline. She screamed like a teenager having a tantrum, half anger, half agony, half fear. 150% fucking psycho. The bathroom was now pitch black, and my flashlight couldn't penetrate the liquid beyond the door. Through the shroud, her petite fingers emerged and wrapped around the doorframe. Her little nails dug into the wood and ripped off a chunk off either side as she suddenly dashed out from the dark and lunged at me. It was in this moment that I saw her face for the first time. She was no woman I'd ever seen. She had an elongated mouth, like something between human and dog. Her eyes were nothing but pale gray dots, half hidden beneath long hair. There was a profound misery in her, intensified by her hunched stance and figure so slender that I could see joints in her bones move. Her beastly mouth opened to receive my neck, but in that split second, I managed to position the saber just right. I thrust my blade into her mouth and jammed it with force down her windpipe. She half-heartedly finished her interrupted strike by slapping her petite fingers against me. It should have been impossible, but those tiny nails ripped into my shirt like claws, and when she rolled off of me, she pulled with her half of my shirt. I'd now had 3 wounds from her, and I was covered in blood. She may have been vulnerable to the light, but her strength was undeniable. Yet, here she lay, spastically flailing her long limbs like out-of-control fire hoses as her skin sizzled away. Half the saber's blade was shoved down her neck, and she was trying to pull it out. But every time her fingers touched the blade, her fingers began to burn. Finally, she grabbed the hilt and managed to pull the saber out. She then flung it with hatred back into the office. I was now without a weapon, and she was still alive. A black and murky liquid poured out of her mouth, along with bouts of smoke. The darkness of the bathroom suddenly began to leak out, reaching for her, enveloping her with a coating. I knew not what mystical beast she was, but something told me it was about to regenerate. The dark wrapped around her ankle and pulled her with a sudden jolt back into the depth of the bathroom before slamming the door shut. From here, I could see that the saber had broken beyond repair, so I stumbled down the stairs. My phone had shattered from the fall and didn't respond, so I began collecting makeshift bonfires. Something told me that this was only the beginning of her fight. I prepared my stash so that I could light a dozen bonfires with the flick of a big lighter, then turned my attention to first aid. I downed another handful of painkillers, along with some whiskey, then used the rest of my shirt and whiskey to make a Molotov cocktail, which I set on the counter alongside the bonfires. If I die, it will be in flames and fire, not in the shadows. The left side of my chest was covered in blood, so I stuffed paper towels into my wound and used an entire roll of duct tape to compress it. I did the same with my ear. I already said I wasn't a good medic. Blood loss had made me dizzy, so I unpacked my espresso machine, which had still been in a moving box, and filled a cup with 6 espresso pods. For good measure, I used another roll of tape to further compress my wounds. This did reduce the amount that my lungs could expand, but I was hoping coffee could make up for my lack of oxygen. Then, without heating it up or even grabbing a fork, I shoveled some buttered chicken and rice into my mouth for good measure. So there I stood, smeared in curry and blood, shirtless and wrapped in duct tape, operating on coffee, buttered chicken, and whiskey. Never in my life had I felt so fucking ready for war. When all the lights in my house turned off simultaneously, I wasn't even shocked. Somehow, I had anticipated this. Autopilot took over, and I began lighting my pots and pans bonfires. My anxiety used to drive me to madness. Every tiny noise in a silent room became amplified by panic attacks. But not now. In the wake of a war, it meant a useful radar. I heard the beast in my house. I knew where she was. She no longer tried to conceal herself. She was in the garage, by the fuse box. That's how she plunged my home into the abyss. And now she came storming towards me, like a cavalry charge, eager to reconquer her domain of darkness. But I stood ready. When she revealed herself by the kitchen doorframe, she halted, and I swear I saw fear in those pale gray specks of eyes. I stood with a flaming pan in each outstretched arm, glowing orange and defiant of her domain. She was a threat to me as much as I was a threat to her. "I'm going to burn this house down with you inside of it," I stated bluntly. "No! Don't you ever say anything else," I shouted back. The only response she gave was dropping down on all four and charging toward me like a rabid animal. I held both pans in front of me like shields of light. Shields she easily sidestepped. She was much faster than me, and I was again struck in the side of my head, the same as the previous one. I wasn't certain how much damage I could take. Flames rained all around us as fabric and splinters exploded through the air. One of the pots, I simply turned it upside down and held it against the top of her head, blinding her as I slipped away before she could strike me again. I then grabbed another pot and dumped it on her back before making an escape to the dining room, where I lit the Molotov cocktail. I saw her in the kitchen screaming and fighting the flames. Instead of chucking the Molotov at her, I threw it at the base of the curtains. The fabric immediately caught flame and filled the entire dining room with an eruption of orange. The beast then charged towards me from the kitchen, wailing and moaning a putrid anger. I darted out the far dining room exit and looped around the back to the kitchen. She was more animal than human after all, and I felt confident that I could outsmart her. The flames were not doing as well as I had hoped they would. I grabbed a glass bottle of expensive olive oil and threw it as hard as I could onto the floor. In an instant, a cloud of oil erupted and engulfed me in flame. I thought for sure I had just committed accidental suicide. The cloud left existence as soon as it came. It did little other than just make the floor slippery and sharp with glass. It was worth a try, but produced nothing of value. The beast came charging after me. I threw 2 flaming pots in her direction, forcing her to cover her face and eyes while I grabbed the last bonfire, a saucepan, and made way for the kitchen exit. The beast slipped on the oil-covered ground and fell into the shards of glass and burning remnants of my first 2 bonfires. Her wails echoed through the entire house, humming from all directions. This final bonfire acted as a torch in the dark caverns of my home as I barreled towards the garage. The darkness enveloped me, and it seemed it tried to snuff the bonfire, but failed. Instead, it could only reduce my field of vision to near null. The beast could be heard behind me, somewhere in the pitch black, but I didn't turn to look. The sound of her struggle indicated that the oil had reduced her speed, giving me an edge. I opened the garage door and hit the light switch, knowing it wouldn't turn on until I reached the fuse box. When I did reach the fuse box, I saw under the flickering lights that she had ripped out every single wire. There was literally no repairing it. She was only 4 steps away. I jumped into the drive seat of my Mustang, locked the door behind me, and turned on the high beams. The demon was caught in the middle and let out a shriek. The shadows of the garage retreated back into the corners, slower than before, but a retreat nonetheless. The demon shrank and jumped out of the lights, then bolted out of the garage. The high beams were too much for even me, but they meant life. A knee-high smoke crawled into the garage from the dining room, but I wasn't nearly done. I crawled under my car with a bucket. It was at this moment I felt most vulnerable, but my anxiety wasn't going haywire, indicating to me that it was safe. At this point, I would rely on my instinct. I began draining my fuel tank and rummaging through the moving boxes in the garage, along with some rags and turpentine. I now lugged with me a sloshing bucket of gasoline. Any misstep would now mean a very uncomfortable death, but it was me or her, or both of us, and I would rather see us both die than just me. With my saucepan forward, I stepped back into the hallway. To my left, my dining room glowed in epic orange. I ran toward the dining room and hurled the bucket into the fire, erupting that room with a magnificent pressure and heat. Fire spewed out in all directions, and I was knocked back. Noxious gas and thick air surrounded me. My saucepan had slipped from my grip, and I was left to crawl towards the back door on all fours like an animal, like the beast. From all angles and every room, I heard the cries and agony. The walls were vibrating. The black liquid seeped from every corner, pooling at my feet like an icy sludge. Something I had felt while hiking Glacial Peaks was somehow in my house, but I knew I was winning. I could feel it in the pain and suffering of the witch as she cried. I just had to make it to the back door, and I could watch my house go up in flames. Even if I never return to Arizona and I'm trapped in this strange plane of existence for the rest of my life, let it be so. I'll die here, and drag her down with me. Just as I grabbed the door handle, the witch materialized from the corner of the room, where the thick sludge streamed down like a frozen waterfall. I slipped outside and slammed the door shut, feeling the vibration of her slam against it. Something told me that I was safe outside, or whatever that meant. This was my first time setting foot into this strange and alien world of flat grass. The demon moaned in agony and pain, then wept and cried. I looped around the house and collapsed onto the front lawn. The fire had spread all through the bottom floor, escaping through the windows, where it then caught flame on the exterior of the second floor. The crackling was only eclipsed by the witch's moan. I sat there, watching my house go up in flame along with everything else I owned. I had bought that house outright with my life savings. Somehow there was no overwhelming despair within me, just a peaceful indifference. After a few hours, the middle collapsed inward, sagging the upper floor down to the ground in a cacophony of creaking wood and hissing flame. All I could think was, try to find a shadow there, bitch. Somewhere in that pile of smoldering flame, the witch had been slain. I had been awake more or less for 3 days straight, and now lay in the cool grass. The last memory I had of that night was staring up at the Goliath of a moon. Peace enveloped me, and my mind shut down. October 27th, 2023. I felt like I had blinked. I closed my eyes for 1 second, and the monolithic moon was gone. Dazed, I sat upright and found myself in nighttime Arizona, a smoldering red pile where my house once stood. I assumed firefighters would ultimately show up, but no. There were no sirens, no emergency lights, only a distant pair of headlights cutting through the dark landscape. Without urgency, a black sedan halted 30 feet from me. We stared at each other for a moment when all doors opened simultaneously. Out stepped 4 people, 3 men and 1 woman, all wearing sunglasses and black suits. They stared cautiously at me, then exchanged glances between themselves in confusion. Finally, one shouted, "Who are you?" Me? I pointed towards myself, irritated by the question. I then pointed back to them and asked, "Who are you?" "You're not supposed to be here," said the woman strictly. "This is my property. You're not supposed to be here," I shouted back. What followed was a strange silence, other than the crackling bonfire that was once my haunted home. Glancing between the glowing pit and the black sedan, I then said more calmly, "But I could use a ride." The 4 of them approached me, all holding wallets high, as if to show me a badge. However, they were too far from me to see what branch of government body they were operating under. As they approached, she asked, "What are you doing here?" "Oh, insurance fraud." "You picked the wrong house to squat. This is government property, and not somewhere you want to find yourself." "Government property? What the hell are you talking about? What is this? Some kind of experiment? I bought this house a month ago. I've been living here for a week." You've been living here for a week? Repeated the woman slowly, as if processing that information was impossible. You're telling us that you slept in that house? Barely, but yes. The older man in the black looked towards a colleague of his and said, "Cuff him." 2 of the 4 agents produced pistols and descended on me. I was then placed in the middle seat in the back of the sedan, between the 2 agents, who still had their guns pushed into my stomach. I didn't complain. As far as I was concerned, I was happy to leave that place. They brought me to an office building and put me in a cold interrogation room. I thought I was going to have to wait for hours, but someone entered only a minute or so after me. He was a skinny man with sunglasses and a white button-down. "Mr. Murre," he read my name off a clipboard. He began pacing slowly. "Mr. Austin Murre, private contractor, contracted pen tester, and cybersecurity engineer for the CIA." He then looked at me and said with a hard H, "I hate the CIA. We always have to clean up after those arrogant, bumbling buffoons. And again today, Mr. Murre." He threw his clipboard on the table, its wooden back clanking against the metal. It was a thick pile on me with notable information. My place of birth, ethnicity, work history, a first girlfriend, my internet provider, and IP address. There was even a note that read, "Deducted $870 off business expenses under label work shoes." "I can explain that," I said while pointing toward the file. "We're not the IRS, Mr. Murre. We don't care about your taxes. What the hell were you doing there?" "That's my fucking house, man. I paid $260,000 for it. You couldn't have bought that house because it was never for sale. I can prove it. I have all the correspondence on my email. You can see my bank statements and everything. You know how hard it is to withdraw $260,000 from your bank?" I could see my own face in his shades as he blankly stared at me. He then pulled the laptop from a satchel and told me to log in. When I had logged into my email, he snatched the laptop back and began scrolling. I told him, "I can't let you do that. There are state secrets in there. I signed an NDA. We supersede the CIA," he said before handing the laptop to a coworker just outside the door. He then came back to the table where he leaned with his hands on the chair's backrest. His face was shrouded by the shadow, something that made me shiver. Can we turn on the lights, please?" I asked him. He ignored my question and instead asked his own. "Do you know who Victor Lustig is? He was a con man, famous for selling the Eiffel Tower on 2 separate occasions. I always wondered how anyone could fall for something like that. Only a fool would fall for that." I stared blankly at him, or rather, the dark enigma where his face should be. Only the glint of his golden aviators gave me an indication of where his eyes were. When I realized why he had shared that anecdote with me, my anxiety was briefly replaced with profound embarrassment and disappointment. I rested my forehead on the table and groaned. The mysterious agent regarded my misery with disinterest. After coming to terms with the fact that I had been scammed out of my life savings, that creeping feeling came back. "Can we please turn on the lights?" "Mr. Murre, I don't think you're a fool," he continued dismissively. "To have survived a week within the walls of the containment zone is a feat few can boast. I need to know how you did it." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold feeling washed over me. I could sense it when she was near. What the fuck is she anyway? How did you sense it, Mr. Murre? A feeling similar to anxiety, like I would have a panic attack. My heart started pounding. My eyes searched the dark and sweat glazed my skin. She was in the room. "I feel it now! Turn on the fucking lights! Turn them on! She's here! She's right behind you!" Suddenly, from elsewhere, my request was answered. The agent hadn't moved, and yet the light snapped on. He looked back just in time to see the shadow retreat like liquid into the corners. He then looked back up at me, and then to the tinted window. After a long pause, he said, "Mr. Murre, you work for us now."